Hey, good morning. I'm Patricia Murphy. It's Wednesday. This is Seattle Now. The Seattle Convention Center takes up more than 1.5 million square feet of real estate downtown. It brings the possibility of year-round tourism and extra business for the surrounding hotels, bars, and restaurants. Despite hosting more events than ever before, the corporation behind the convention center says the financial situation is fragile. Seattle Times reporter David Kroman is here to tell us why in a minute. But first, let's get you caught up. Washington's highest in the nation estate tax could be dialed back. Democrats in the state legislature raised tax rates last year as high as 35% for the largest estates. Now, some state senators are considering repealing those increases, according to the Seattle Times. The paper says Democrats like Senate Majority Leader Jamie Peterson are worried too many wealthy people are leaving the state to avoid paying the tax. Scientists with Seattle's Fred Hutch Cancer Center say they've developed a first-of-its-kind antibody that blocks Epstein-Barr virus. The pathogen is linked to cancer, MS, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and other conditions. They say this new breakthrough prevents the virus from infecting human immune cells. Researchers say the potential therapy needs to be tested for safety and would then proceed to clinical trials. And the heated rivalry between the U.S. and Canada reaches the ultimate world stage tomorrow when they compete in the Olympic gold medal game in women's hockey. Team USA features 4 players from the Seattle Torrent to keep your eye on: Hillary Knight, Alex Carpenter, Hannah Bilka, and Kayla Barnes. Thursday's game is a rematch from 2022 when Canada took the gold in a 3-2 win. It begins at 10:10 a.m., televised on the USA Network and streaming on Peacock. We're back with more headlines on tonight's episode of Seattle Now. There are plenty of big events in this city that need a home. Pillars of nerd culture like Emerald City Comic-Con and PAX West, or trade shows like this week's Northwest Flower and Garden Festival. They're all happening at the Seattle Convention Center. The older of the two buildings was built in 1985. By the 2010s, things needed an upgrade.
Starting in 2017, they dumped a huge amount of money into building the newer building that people probably see when they're driving on I-5.
That's Seattle Times reporter David Kroman, who's been looking into the convention center's finances, which are in a fragile place right now, according to CEO Jennifer LeMaster. Despite the name, the Seattle Convention Center is not owned or run by the city. It's run as a public facilities district, like T-Mobile Park. So basically,
a small group of people that has the authority to tax you to run and build and govern their thing, in this case, the convention center.
The pandemic hit the convention center right where it hurts. No one was gathering for events, and its funding resources at the state and county level dried up. And 6 years later, the center is still struggling, despite kicking events back into high gear. Seattle Times City reporter David Kroman is here to talk about why. David, good to see you.
Good to see you.
Thanks for coming in. So the Seattle Convention Center is one of the few places in the city where people can go to host huge events like Comic-Cons. I remember back in the day seeing Mary Kay conventions there. It was one of the, honestly, you haven't lived, David, until you've seen like 600 Mary Kay ladies in the same outfit alongside the Forensic Pathologists Convention.
Oh, man, I have to book that.
It was a day. It was a day. What was the vision of the center when it was built?
It's the same kind of vision for any convention center, which is we want to expand our tourism to attract people year round. You know, it's pretty easy to get people to come to your city in the summer, but by hosting big events and creating incentives for people to gather in Seattle year-round, you sort of take the boom and bust cycle of visitation and hopefully kind of smooth it out a little bit. The idea, at least, is you're bringing in business to the surrounding restaurants and clubs and bars all year-round outside of just the normal tourist season.
Yeah, those Mary Kay ladies, they have to go someplace to go eat lunch and dinner on their break in between plenary exhibits. We talked a little bit about the expansion in 2017. What was the logic behind adding this second building?
The logic behind it was the current building, you really couldn't run concurrent events. So if the Comic-Con, for example, was in town, that kind of booked that convention center and excluded any other events from coming in. So the thought was, hey, if we can have two buildings, we can run 2 Comic-Cons or 2 equivalents of Comic-Cons. And at the time, boosters of the convention center were saying that they were turning away as many as 300 events a year because of that, because they couldn't double book. That was a pretty convincing argument to Washington State and King County officials, and that was enough to get the ball rolling on this new expansion.
You talked a little bit about the fact that this isn't necessarily a city building. It's a private business with state and county funding, a little bit in the weeds, but it is contentious for some people. What does the convention center mean to the city?
There's a lot of fingers in the convention center pot in the Washington State, King County, Seattle. I think for the city, its kind of main impact is what it means for use of space, and some of it public space. Of course, it's a very imposing facility. Old building, arches over Pike Street, and the new building, they had to use some city alleyways to build on top of it. It's a very kind of commanding presence. So there's the space aspect. And then, again, for the businesses and the establishments in the area, it represents something like a magnet that can bring in business from the outside. And so, I think when we're talking about convention centers, there's always a debate around, are they the best use of public space, public dollars, because there are public dollars that go into making this succeed, and is that worth the benefit that comes with the kind of promised economic additions or a windfall that comes with having conventions come to your city?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the economic because, of course, convention centers only work when people book the rooms and book events there. 2020 was a really rough time for the convention center, especially since they had just built this large addition. Let's talk about the pandemic years for the convention center.
Yeah, the convention center was hit on a number of levels. I mean, for one, there's the obvious, which is it is dependent on in-person meetings. And those, of course, all went away during 2020 and much of 2021. But, on a deeper level, the funding for the new facility was predicated on tax dollars continuing to flow in from people staying in hotels. When they started down the path of building this new facility, that was about as safe of a bet as you could ask for in Seattle. All the indicators were showing tourism climbing. There was a ton of new hotel construction. Rooms were getting booked. There was really no indication that this was an unsafe bet. Of course, when the pandemic came, all of those tax dollars dried up. And so what that meant is it ate up the stream of public dollars that was going into the convention center to help it operate. But also the bonding to build this new facility was also dependent on those hotel and lodging tax dollars. And so they hadn't actually even finished the new building in 2020, and suddenly they were looking like they were going to run out of money before they were able to get it built. And so, of course, all sort of forms of hospitality struggled during the pandemic, but it's hard to find an example that was hit so top to bottom as the convention center on every level.
It actually seems like some people's fears about publicly funding this convention center became realized during the pandemic.
Anybody who was saying, I told you so about what the pandemic was doing, I think it's a little hard to say that you could predict that happening, but it did sort of confirm some general fears, which is how much of these public tax dollars can we continue to devote to the convention center, and then reasonably how much benefit can we expect to get back from it? And that's an ongoing debate, and it's sort of hard to come up with a concrete answer for that. The pandemic complicated that even further because it threw this enormous wrench into the entire operation. It was a bad time for the convention center, but boosters of it say, that was an anomaly. We're on our way back. We're recovering. It's still a good benefit for the city. Whereas some of the skeptics are saying, this entire operation is still dependent on people meeting in person. And I'm not convinced that that's going to continue to be the case.
Well, as we get further from the pandemic, David, people hoped things would level out for the convention center. So how are things now?
The current situation with the convention center is very interesting, and it's what spurred me want to write about it because in some ways it is doing pretty well. The attendance is up. It's higher than it was pre-pandemic, so that's good. The problem, though, there's a couple problems, which is they have built this $2 billion facility, and it's enormous. It's beautiful if you've been there, but it's quite large. It requires a lot more money than they used to operate. And so even though they were getting more attendance, the amount of money that they're spending just to keep the place open and operational is not keeping up with that. So they have yet to get to a point where they're actually making a profit off of that. The other kind of more existential piece is that during the pandemic, to continue construction on the new building and to keep people employed and to basically float the the convention center as a whole, they spent down basically $200 million in reserves, down to, it wasn't literally zero, but for a $3 billion campus, it was essentially the equivalent of getting a reserve down to zero. And, where are we? We're 6 years removed from the pandemic. Those reserves are still basically at something close to zero. And if you are looking at just the sheer size and scope of the convention center, both the new Summit building and the old Arch building, not having any reserves puts you in a really delicate and fragile place. Because for one, the old building is old. It has maintenance needs. But also there's this kind of interesting thing where the new building in some ways is so successful that they're having a little bit of trouble getting people to accept bookings in the old building.
Oh.
And so in some ways that, they're kind of cannibalizing their own business. And so now they're saying, look, if we want to continue to be a successful business, we need to sink a lot of money into the old building and bring that up somewhere close to competitive with our new building, but without any reserves or any particularly clear path right now to refill those reserves. It's sort of difficult to imagine how exactly they do that.
Oh, wow. So they are in a real financial situation here, despite doing better than any time in recent memory. David, what is the mood? How are they thinking about this? Are they going to offer discounts on the left side of the house there?
Well, it's funny, actually. The CEO, Jennifer LeMaster, told me a story about how she had booked a convention in the new building. And then, I don't know, some number of months later, a different, larger convention came to her and say, hey, we want that weekend too. So she went to the original bookers and offered them free admission to the old building if you'll move. And they said no. They said, no, well, we will pay our booking fee because we want to be in the new building.
Wow.
And to her, that was, a good example of like, we have to really think hard about what it is that we're doing with that old building. As far as what they do next, they kind of briefly explored asking for more government help. They went to the Seattle City Council and asked them if there was any way that they might divert some new tax dollars to the convention center. At one point, they had hoped that maybe the state would send a little extra money their way. The current budget realities of both the state and the city, I think they pretty quickly realized that wasn't going to happen. And so what they're saying right now is, there's kind of only one way out of this hole, and it's we have to start booking a lot more business.
Wow. And the example you gave is fascinating because if I am just, say, an attorneys group that's going to put on a convention for real estate attorneys, I need to attract people to come to Seattle to my convention to make that worth it. So
exactly,
you can almost understand why they refused to move to the other side of the house.
Yeah, exactly. Because in the convention world, what they're seeing is associations. So what you were talking about, say real estate groups, those bookings are actually returning because it is profitable to those groups. They make some amount of money, whatever it is, trade shows, recruiting. It's financially advantageous for them to have those meetings. It's the corporate events that are considered kind of a hard cost to, say, Amazon. They're just spending that money out of their pocket. They don't expect to recoup it. Those events are not coming back so much. So if you're an association, and to your point, if you want to put on this big gleaming show, kind of get people in the mood to spend money, make bookings, whatever it is, you're going to want to be in the nicest place possible. Whereas maybe it was the Amazons of the world that would have been more willing to do it in the less kind of fancy place, but those events are just not coming back as quickly.
Yeah, the world has really shifted post-pandemic. It's kind of fascinating. David, is there a world where something goes wrong for the Seattle Convention Center and this real estate downtown becomes unusable?
I don't think we're anywhere near that level of risk. They're not saying that they're flashing the alarm bells exactly right now. So it's not like they're on the verge of bankruptcy or anything like that. But the convention business is, as one analyst described it to me, it's really an arms race in a lot of ways because there is a finite number of conventions and every city in the country is competing to win that business. And so what happens is Las Vegas is sinking billions into convention centers. Houston is sinking billions. All these other cities that are pretty willing to spend a lot of money on their convention centers. And so the kind of risk, I think, for Seattle's convention center, at least as they're saying it, is, if we don't do anything to keep up with those other businesses, the fear is kind of a long, slow decline. And I don't think that's really a risk for the new building because, again, it is pretty well respected and it is sought after, but it is more the question of what happens to that original space. Does it just slowly continue to lose business? I think for critics of the entire endeavor of convention centers, this is kind of what they predicted is, this is promised to us originally as a one-time cost that will have lasting benefit. But their argument is the reality is it's never just a one-time cost. Once you build these things, you have to continue sinking a lot of money and public dollars into them. And skeptics say it's just not worth it.
Really interesting reporting, David Kroman. David Kroman reports on city government for the Seattle Times. Really appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks so much for having me.
Appreciate you listening to Seattle Now, and thanks to our generous donors for your financial support. Make our day by taking a minute to rate and review the show on your favorite podcast app. Today's episode was produced by Vaughn Jones. It was edited by Caroline Chamberlain Gomez. Our production team also includes Andy Hurst, Brooklyn Jamerson Flowers, and Paige Browning. Greg Kramer does our theme music. Seattle Now and KUOW Public Radio are members of the NPR network. I'm Patricia Murphy. We're back tonight with evening headlines.